Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to be here. What's Jewish about fat activism? We're so excited for this learning. And we want to thank our friend and partner here, Edith Cox, who was really the visionary and supporter behind enabling this amazing program to happen and bumped up Rabbi Bromberg's amazing work on my radar to the next level. And that she has also kindly offered to follow up potentially with a or some discussion groups or activist groups, ways to put the learning into action to go deeper on a personal level and on a communal level. So feel free to circle back to us if you would like to do that, no matter where you are, local or distant. So friends, today we have here the founder and president of Fat Torah, Rabbi Minna Bromberg, PhD, who is passionate about bringing her 3 decades of experience in fat activism to writing, teaching, and change-making at the nexus of Judaism and body liberation. Minna received her doctorate in sociology from Northwestern University with a dissertation on identity formation in interfaith couples, and was ordained at Hebrew College in 2010, same year I was ordained. She lives in Jerusalem, the holy city of Yerushalayim, with her husband, Rabbi Dr. Alan Abrams, and their 2 children. Thrilled to have you here today, Rabbi Minna Bromberg. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and I want to start with a song that's been central to my own body liberation journey. And I like to open with song really as a way of just welcoming everyone into this space and giving ourselves a moment or two to fully arrive and in a space that's going to have some material that's going to be new and unfamiliar to some of you, and quite welcome to others of you, and maybe even a little strange at some points in time. So this offering of song is just a way of giving us some space to arrive together here. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that our loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that our loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that our loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. So our topic today is what's Jewish about fat activism, and we're going to start with what is fat activism, because that seems like an important place to start. And I want to start actually by sharing with you a little bit of my own journey in this work. And that is to start with the fact that I started dieting as a 7-year-old, mostly because I hoped that it would be a way for me to have more friends. I think that was my main thinking at the time. And was really, I would say, quote unquote, supported in that by everyone around me. Everyone around me seemed to think it was a good idea for me as a 7-year-old to try to lose weight, which is an odd thing in retrospect for anyone to think, because 7-year-olds are supposed to be growing. And by the time I was 16, I had been on all kinds of diets and really developed a pretty thorough hatred, I would say, for my body. And thankfully, by the time I was 16, I was ready to let go of that. And I found my way through a few steps that I'll skip over to the fat acceptance movement. And at the time, I think it bears mentioning that at the time, to be involved in any kind of social change movement meant that we were operating without an internet. And so this meant that people were finding each other through magazines and self-published zines and organizational newsletters. And I think one of the things that many people don't know about fat activism is that it exists. And so fat activism has existed in the United States in an organized fashion since 1969, when an organization formed called the National Association, shortly came to be known as the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. And it was actually, interestingly, given the way we currently think about activism and who ought to be advocating for themselves and all the things that we know about, how our identities should be expressed and the desire to have people advocating for their own identities rather than being advocated on their behalf by others. The National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance was actually started by a handful of thin white men who were concerned about the way that fat stigma impacted their large partners, their large female partners. So thin heterosexual white men founded the movement. Thank you for doing that. And then, over the last 50 years, it's really been a process of figuring out how to create a movement that is more, that's not about us without us, and that's also recognizing all of the different forms of systemic oppression that intersect or interact with weight stigma. And I have to say, I'm very proud that that NAFA is doing a really wonderful job, and you can find out more about them on the Google if you're interested in that. But I want to take even one more step back and say a word or two about the word fat, because it's still a word that I'm sometimes surprised to find has so many negative connotations. Because part of the work of fat activism is simply but not easily restoring the term fat to a place of moral neutrality. And so one of my favorite definitions of the word fat, or why I, as someone who is a large fat woman, use it to describe myself, is that fat refers to adipose tissue that all human bodies are supposed to have in some measure. And that fat people are people with a lot of adipose tissue, and that there's really nothing particularly good or bad about that on its most basic level. And so that's one of the reasons that I use the word fat to describe myself, because I believe in reclaiming it as a morally neutral way of describing a particular type of body in the infinite diversity of human bodies that we have. So, and we'll talk more about that infinite diversity when we get into the What's Jewish About Fat Activism piece later in our time together. So I want to now move to sharing a little bit about why we need fat activism, and that is to share a little bit about fat phobia. And what I've found is that one of the easiest ways into this is to actually start right off by talking about different kinds of fat phobia or anti-fatness or weight stigma, which are terms that I personally tend to use interchangeably. So I'm going to show you a slide that I created that's, for me, a helpful illustration of this. As I'm moving through any of this, you should please feel free, if you have questions or comments, to just put them right in the chat. We are going to have time later for a Q&A section and also for some discussion amongst yourselves in breakout rooms. But absolutely, the chat is a great place if there are things that are coming up for you along the way to go ahead and just put them in the chat, and I will either attend to them right away or save them for our Q&A time in a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to share with you this screen. So when we think about different types of fat phobia, different folks have different ways of dividing these up. The terms that I use are systemic, interpersonal, and internalized. And so internalized, so let me show you what I mean by these. So internalized fat phobia is something that people of any size can experience. And it's the way that any of us might judge ourselves or experience body dissatisfaction or think that we ought to be thinner regardless of our size, or engage in restrictive or self-harming behaviors. So internalized fat phobia can certainly be impactful and harmful in people's lives. And we know from research that weight stigma, experiencing weight stigma for people in any size body, increases their risk of developing an eating disorder, which is, and eating disorders are among the most deadly of all mental illnesses. So we know that this internalized fat phobia that can impact people of any size is genuinely harmful to people, and I don't want to minimize that at all. Interpersonal fat phobia are the comments about our bodies or what we're eating that we might get. It turns out that when they've done studies of where we are exposed most to weight stigma, that in fact people are exposed most to weight stigma in the context of their close family and friends. So this kind of interpersonal fat phobia is often happening in the context of intimate relationships. The second most common place where people experience interpersonal fat phobia is in their doctor's office. It's not fun. But one thing the reason that I have this in the middle in sort of my scale of what size of people this kind of fat phobia impacts is that we certainly can have folks who are not in particularly large bodies who happen to have a friend or family member who thinks it's a good idea to criticize that person's body and tell them that they ought to be thinner. So I often encounter people who don't experience systemic fat phobia that we'll talk about in a moment, but have had experiences with a relative or friend who took it upon themselves to make denigrating comments about the size of their body. Systemic fat phobia, which, as with all forms of systemic oppression, we really measure not by our sort of felt experience of it, but by the impacts that it has on us as a group and the way that it impacts our life chances as a group. So fat people as a group in our society experience discrimination in employment and healthcare and education, and lack of physical accommodations in public life. Just to give you one terrible example, there was a study that came out recently that looked at the grading of papers for junior high school students and found that when the person grading the paper was told that the student who had written the paper was fat, that they, on the whole, that fat students or students who the graders were told were fat received lower grades than their thinner counterparts for the same papers. Right, so they took the same papers and told the people who were grading it whether the person who had written it was fat or thin, the student. So we do have this just blatant kinds of discrimination, and it's worth noting that that fatness as a category is not protected from discrimination in employment or education or healthcare in anywhere, with the exception of a couple of municipalities that have passed anti-size discrimination ordinances, and one state, I believe, one of the 50 states, also has legislation, also has law that protects against discrimination for height or weight. Otherwise, we don't have any protection under the law at this point. And if we like, we can talk more about why I think that might be and why that matters. So any questions just about this chart or anything else that I've said so far? All right. So what I want to move on to is just a tiny bit more about the history of fat activism by moving us a little bit farther than the founding of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance in 1969, and moving us to the year 1973, when what had happened was that there was a group of women in Los Angeles who were involved in some radical therapy movements and were also had formed themselves as a chapter of NAFA, as like a local chapter of this national organization. But they split off from NAFA because NAFA, as a larger body, was concerned that they were too radical and that they were too political. And so that group then formed itself as the Fat Underground. And in 1973, they published a Fat Liberation Manifesto that I'm going to share with you. And as you can, the two women who, on behalf of the Fat Underground, actually put this manifesto together, it so happens, we can talk about whether it just so happens or whether there's something to it. It so happens that they were actually both Jewish women, Judy Free Spirit and Aldebaran, who now goes by the name Sarah Fishman. So they're the ones who wrote this. Is there anyone who feels like reading a point or two out loud? Yes, Shmuley.
Starting with number 1 and ending.
Why don't you go through number 3?
Great. We believe that fat people are fully entitled to human respect and recognition. We are angry at mistreatment by commercial and sexist interests. These have exploited our bodies as objects of ridicule, thereby creating an immensely profitable market, selling the false promise of avoidance of or relief from that ridicule. We see our struggle as allied with the struggles of other oppressed groups against classism, racism, sexism, ageism, financial exploitation, imperialism, and the like.
Jesse Rubenstein, would you like to read, or do you have a question?
I would love to read.
Wonderful. Let me move us down. Will you take us through 4 and 5?
Of course. We demand equal rights for fat people in all aspects of life, as promised in the Constitution of the United States. We demand equal access to goods and services in the public domain and an end to discrimination against us in the areas of employment, education, public facilities, and health services. We single out as our special enemies the so-called reducing industries. These include diet clubs, reducing salons, fat farms, diet doctors, diet books, diet foods and food supplements, surgical procedures, appetite suppressants, drugs, and gadgetry such as wraps and reducing machines.
You can, there you go, you can keep going on 5.
We demand that they take responsibility for their false claims, acknowledge that their products are harmful to the public health, and publish long-term studies proving any statistical efficacy of their products. We make this demand knowing that over 99% of all weight loss programs, when evaluated over a 5-year period, fail utterly, and also knowing the extreme proven harmfulness of frequent large changes in weight.
Thank you. Does anyone want to take us home? Yes,
I'll
Edith.
take it.
Okay, so Edith, why don't you do 6, and then Pam, you can really take us home.
We repudiate the mystified science which falsely claims that we are unfit. It has both caused and upheld discrimination against us in collusion with the financial interest of insurance companies, the fashion and garment industries, reducing industries, the food and drug industries, and the medical and psychiatric establishment.
Yeah.
We refuse to be subjugated to the interests of our enemies. We fully intend to reclaim power over our bodies and our lives. We commit ourselves to pursue these goals together. Fat people of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose.
Thank you. So is there anything surprising or particularly interesting to you about this manifesto that was published in 1973? You're welcome to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and talk, or write in the chat.
What I find interesting is that they're publishing this in 1973, and yet here we are, a long time later, nearly 50 years later, and none of it has changed.
Yeah. And in fact, some of it has gotten worse, right? So the reducing industry that they talk about, the diet industry in the US is now a $72 billion industry. And that doesn't even include all of the other all the other aspects of the wellness industry that have a lot of fat phobia in them as well, even if they're not specifically aimed at weight loss. And the other thing that's happened since this was published is that in the mid-90s, we saw this real shift in medicine where size became really codified, where fatness became codified as illness, right? So this has been something that had been happening throughout the sort of second 2/3 of the 20th century, but it was really in the mid-90s that that we see this whole idea of a quote unquote war on obesity, right? And the sort of, again, codifying fatness as a disease that wasn't even the case when they were writing. And I think also, they're right that already by the time that they're writing, we already have good data that diets don't work. We already have had basically since the 1960s good data that, as they say, over 99% of all weight loss programs over a 5-year period fail utterly. I was recently at my own doctor's office, and when I quoted this statistic that I wouldn't say 99, I would say 95 to 98% of all the intentional weight loss efforts fail over a 5-year period. And my doctor said, well, just because 98% of people fail, and I had to interrupt her and say, it's not 98% of the people it's not the people who are failing, right? That her automatic response was, to turn it into this sense that, that it was people who are failing. And I think that one of the things that's important to say here is that, then we have this question of, why is weight loss something that's still advocated for among, people who know how science works? And I think it has something to do with the fact that humans are really terrible estimators of risk and chance. Right. So we also have, the lotteries where people, if they looked at the statistics of what their actual chances were of winning the Mega Millions or whatever it is, would maybe understand, how very small their chance was. But when the payoff is so big, we sort of lose our ability to make good decisions, I would say, about the risks and the chances that we're willing to take. And so what we can see from my perspective, about the fact that the diet industry has now grown to a $72 billion industry in the US is that the promised benefits of losing weight are so great, both in terms of social acceptability and in terms of ideas about health and illness, that people are willing over and over again to make these attempts. And as the manifesto also states, right, that I'm looking at the end of number 5 here, knowing the extreme proven harmfulness of frequent large changes in weight. This is something that's called weight cycling. And it's essentially what people who diet are doing, meaning that they're experiencing these swings in their weight, right? Because they lose weight sometimes when they're dieting and then gain it back whenever the body gets used to metabolizing at a lower number of calories or whatever it is that they're restricting. So, we have this this data already, and have had it for decades and decades, and there's been sort of, I would say, a lag in society catching up with the data. Jesse's asking some, Eddie says that yes, these seem like basic rights that everyone should have. I agree. And Shmuli's asking, what are some of the unique ways that Jews in particular add stigma here in addition to the universal ways? Great, thank you. Between the interpersonal and the systemic, yep, on the group community level, great, we're going to get to that. And how does gender affect these lack of human rights? And are there differences particularly found in the Jewish community? Great, we are going to get to all of that. So I want to say one more word about fat activism, and then we're going to do some breakout rooms where I want you to have a chance to talk about how we think about bodies in Jewish communal spaces, and then we'll have a larger conversation about that, and I can share some of what I found in both my own experience and some of the data and stories that I've been collecting since I started this work. Okay, so the one last thing before we move into our breakout rooms that I want to say about fat activism is that there has been this growth since the early 2000s of what's usually called the body positivity movement. And this is a movement that largely has happened online and at times has had this incredible outpouring of women of all sizes and women of all races, and a lot of intersectionality, and sort of thinking about the ways that fat Black bodies experience both racism and fat phobia different than their white and or thin counterparts. And so the body positivity movement has had some incredible things going on in it. But one thing that's happened that folks have sort of noticed more recently is that the movement has a little bit been sort of taken over by mostly thinner, mostly white women who are really very focused on, and you can hear this just in the term body positivity, really focused on sort of a narrow sense of our relationship with our own bodies. And you can see, if we look back, let me just share this again, if we look back at types of fat phobia, the body positivity movement is really, where did it go? Is really emphasizing this internalized fat phobia, right? So it's about, it's mostly about women judging ourselves. And part of what's problematic about this is that the more that it focuses exclusively on internalized fat phobia, the more it can tend to sort of throw other folks under the bus. So that's one concern about the body positivity movement and how it's distinct from fat activism or fat liberation. Another piece, though, is that you also, it is a wonderful and joyous thing to have a loving relationship with our own bodies, and it's certainly been in a central part of my own liberation, is to find ways to be accepting and loving my own body. At the same time, one thing that the body positivity movement tends to sort of over focus on is the idea that this is all just about how each of us individually feels about our own body. And that is neither necessary nor sufficient to fat liberation, but by which I mean you actually don't have to love your own body in order to believe in these basic human rights, as we were saying. And when we overemphasize the need to love our own bodies in order to do this work, it can feel like this real burden, right? Like we're not allowed to speak out about discrimination against people because of their body size, unless we're coming from this place of already completely accepting and loving our own bodies. And so loving your body is a lovely and delightful thing, but it's not actually a requirement for believing that we should find ways to confront weight stigma certainly in our communal lives. So that's one piece. And the other is just that it's not really that loving our own bodies is not sufficient, in the sense that it's not gonna get us all the way there, which I can say from personal experience that I often walk around in public life loving my own body, and that has never protected me from people on the street who know nothing about me stopping me to make comments about how they think I should be living my life in my body. And it's maybe increased my ability to have resilience to continue going out in public, despite knowing that that I will be accosted by strangers. But it doesn't actually decrease the frequency of or impact of those kinds of comments, and it also doesn't protect me from that. So it doesn't protect me from interpersonal fat phobia, and it also doesn't protect me from systemic fat phobia. So those are, I think that's an important distinction to make. And the one last thing that I had forgotten to say is that you can see in the manifesto that one of the things that the folks who wrote it are really relying on is science, right? And is this whole scientific data interrogating the way that fat people are treated. And another thing that develops in the mid 1990s, just as fatness is being sort of codified as a disease, is something called the Health at Every Size movement, which is pioneered by Lindo Bacon, and is basically focusing on this whole idea that, we now have other ways other than fatness of measuring people's health, and that all of the health conditions that fat people are at increased risk for, it's not clear that fatness is a cause of that increased risk. B, it's not clear that weight loss is going to help, since weight loss doesn't work in the long term. And so the Health at Every Size movement is really advocating for getting away from this idea that that correlation equals causation, for one thing, right? The sense that just because fat people are at increased risk of certain diseases doesn't necessarily mean that that our fatness is what's causing it, and that in fact one contributing factor could be weight stigma itself. So just to give one example of the way that weight stigma impacts fat people's health is that fat people as a group avoid seeking medical treatment, which means that we end up at the doctor sicker than our thinner counterparts, because we've been trying to avoid the stigmatizing impacts of going to the doctor. So that's just one little example of that. Okay, so to shift us into this whole question of what's Jewish about this, I want us to do some breakout room time. What did you learn in your breakout rooms?
I think, in our breakout room, we talked about our personal experiences with it. So I guess it seems like I learned about another person's personal experience, sort of with at least sort of internalized fat phobia, and then also people have different concerns about passing it on. Like, so like what we know and have internalized, like, are we also contributing to the perpetual nature of this cycle?
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to share from your own experience, or as Love Wallace did, sharing what you learned in the room more generally, but without naming anyone's names without their permission? Thank you. That's good modeling.
One thing we did talk about in our group, and it's is food is very Jewish. Everything. I know I grew up, every holiday, every family function is all about food. But when you're the heavier person in the family, then it's like, do I engage in the food, or do I just go in the other room and don't engage in the food? So it's you can't win for losing kind of situation sometimes at the holidays and things like that. So it's a culture a lot about food.
Yeah, absolutely.
We talked about how sometimes for Jews, food is love. And if you're not supposed to have that food, then, are you denied that love? And how hard it can be to navigate if you're supposed to eat the food, like it's a push-pull.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a push-pull, and I would also say that it's just very twisted. So one of my earliest and most traumatizing memories of this that I can remember as a 7 or 8 year old, when I had first started dieting, was being at a family meal and having my bubby put a plate of cookies like for the table, but right in front of me, and look at me and say, "You don't want any of those, do you?" And it was like the most sort of twisted, like, I was a kid, right? So it was sort of this like, did I not? I thought I did, but I knew I wasn't supposed to. And just the way that especially for children, but not only, can really just twist our relationships with love and food and the people who actually say those things to us, right? That it can be become quite a hard thing to make sense of, I would say. Making sense of. Thank you. Other things that you
that I talked about in our session was how, in our breakout room, was how the comments made in a Jewish setting to people can, while well-meaning, are oftentimes misdirected. I'm the daughter of a rabbi, and so I was the congregation's child. And when I was 14 years old, a congregant came up at the oneg when I was eating a piece of cake and said, "Do you really need that piece of cake?" to a 14-year-old child.
Yeah. And I think, as you're pointing out, that particularly in communal spaces where we might have specific roles that make us more visible, or that give people a sense of sort of ownership over us in some way, that people feel sort of freer to say things that are really very harmful. Yeah. And I think that part of the, we want our communities to feel like places of closeness. And when fat phobia is part of that closeness, it can be particularly damaging. And sort of the flip side of that is that, or not the flip side, but sort of the extension of that, right, is that what we aim for in a community is a community of welcome. And so to have any kind of attribute or identity that that is clearly in some way made to feel unwelcome can be particularly harmful, right? It's different. It's certainly different for me to experience a random stranger on the street giving me their opinion about how I should be behaving or living my life than it was certainly when I was a congregational rabbi and I had congregants who wanted to tell me things about how I was living my life. One of my sort of least favorite stories of that was that when I was a relatively new rabbi, the congregation knew that I didn't drive on Shabbat. And so I had a board member, actually, so you can sort of think also about some of the power dynamics there, right? Where this is my congregant and I'm meant to be their rabbi, but this is also a board member of the organization. And I was a freshly minted, young female rabbi. I had a board member who said, "Oh, how far is your walk to synagogue?" And I thought, well, that just seemed like a very factual question. And so I said, 2 miles, it's 2 miles there and back. To which she responded, "Oh, that's going to be so good for you." So again, similar to, right, without any inquiry, right, and to the point about things being well-meaning, right, that if we actually care about what's good for someone or not, we can demonstrate that by asking them. So like even in asking them about what that means to them, right? So she could have even said, "Oh, what's that like for you to walk 2 miles?" Right? She could have actually just made inquiry into whether that was something that I was used to doing, not used to doing, thought was going to be good for me, thought was going to exacerbate some other problem that I was having, right? You can imagine that a 2 mile walk could be good or not good for someone, really depending. And so that's just one example of, some of the kinds of comments that larger people are exposed to. And the way that some of the dynamics of a Jewish community can absolutely play out in the harm that they cause. Anything else that came up in your groups that you'd like to share? Someone shared in the chat something about accessibility and mikveh. Is that something that anyone wanted to say more about?
I guess like the original question was just like, how does this show up? And I was saying in space, like there's a lot of ways that anti-fat bias shows up, and a lot of it is like in spacing. And so I just made the connection from like anti-fat bias in the medical complex for a number of reasons, but structurally, like tables not being able to accommodate people, surgeries not being able to happen because of the weight limits for things, that one of the structural like Jewish things would be like the mikveh, like not all mikveh can accommodate everyone of every size, and accessibility and anti-fat bias also play a connection.
Yeah, so I think sort of two things that you're reminding me of. One is that absolutely there are sort of basic physical accommodation and accessibility questions for the largest among us that show up in various places in Jewish context. So just to say a little bit more about that, the most frequently encountered one of those is just seating, right? So I traveled to, or before the pandemic, right, traveled to a lot of different congregations, and it was, a large source of concern for me whether there was going to be seating that would accommodate me or not. And I have to say that in exactly 0 of those contexts was I ever asked about what kind of accommodation I might need. Which I have to say for myself that I also never asked. Right? I never, when I was going to be a visiting scholar somewhere, asked in advance about what the seating would be like, which in retrospect feels kind of like, what is it that I, as someone who, have been involved in this work for 30 years, still don't have just sort of a script for finding out whether I'm going to be accommodated. So yes, absolutely, physical accessibility. And then also, especially in a place like mikveh, where someone is potentially watching you when you're naked, that this can also be a place where just sort of what might seem like offhand comments can really be quite stigmatizing. So a friend of mine who's also a fat activist told me a story about going to a mikveh and having the mikveh guide tell her that she needed to really be sure, because her breasts and her belly were sort of making contact with her body, you really need to be sure that the water gets everywhere. And my friend was like, this person is seeing me, right? They see my whole body, and yet they seem not to understand like how fat works. Like fat floats. And the idea that you would go into a body of water and that somehow like the water wouldn't go everywhere the way it's supposed to in a mikveh was completely not factual or connected with reality. But I think that fat people often have this experience of feeling both hyper visible and not understood or fully seen. And that for me was such a powerful and troubling example of, you know, both being sort of on display and yet not really understood or seen. Yeah. And seating in sanctuaries, absolutely, yes. Anything else that came up for you? And there's a couple of other pieces in the chat that I want to get to. Thanks. Okay, so Shmuley raised this concern about how family members, teachers, and other students will talk about the body with your children and with their peers. And yes, absolutely. So we know from research that kids as young as 4 and 5 are already have ideas about fatness and about fat being bad and thin being good. And we also have troubling studies about the age at which young kids, and especially young girls, are likely to start dieting or start restricting their eating in some way. And I think this is another example of why, for me, this needs to be a communal conversation, because I think, you know, I can control the way that I talk about my body and other bodies to my children, but I can't control the way that their peers talk to them, or necessarily the way that their teachers or even other family members talk to them. And I saw recently someone who posted in a parenting group that I'm on in Facebook about their 6-year-old daughter being bullied at the park for the kids called her fat. And so this launched a whole conversation in the parenting group that included everything from people trying to assess whether this girl was actually fat, right? As if that was the relevant piece here. Or doing what I often see, which is framing this as a problem of kids having bad manners, right? So whenever someone tells me that they can't believe that someone was so rude to me, it's important for me to clarify that this isn't a question of rudeness or manners, right? That rudeness implies that it's perfectly okay to think these things about fat people, but you should absolutely not speak them, right? That, as if the problem is in whether people are making denigrating comments, as opposed to the problem being anti-fat bias. And we'll talk more about speech, though, because I think it's an important piece of this. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit as well. Yeah, I think that's absolutely why I feel like this needs to be a communal conversation. Okay, I'm going to move into a little bit of Fat Torah prescriptions for what we should be doing about this, if you're all ready for that. So what's been helpful to me in framing all of this is to think about different areas of impact and action. And some of these we've already covered. I'm going to share with you what each of these areas is, and then I'm going to focus on one of them in particular. So the areas that we talk about in our trainings and consultations and courses are sacred space, that really has to do with the physical accessibility issues that we were talking about. And the framing that we usually use for this is around Jewish values of welcoming. And also in connected with this idea of with the Jewish value of welcoming, thinking about what we want our sacred spaces to be. So, and sort of how we want our sacred spaces, meaning our communal spaces, to be a reflection of who we want to belong and feel welcome in our spaces. So that's sacred space. Sacred speech, that's what I'm going to focus on more. I'll focus on more in just a moment. Sacred time has to do with our calendar observances, and has a lot to do also with the way that weight stigma can, as we said, can really impact our relationship with food, and can really damage our relationship with our tradition, with the traditional foods of whatever your Jewish culture is. The best example I have of this is a story that was sort of part of what launched Fat Torah, which was that a year and a half ago, I was at my young daughter's preschool Hanukkah party, and we were dancing around and enjoying ourselves. And I was feeling a little uncomfortable because I was 9 months pregnant at the time, and had this sort of internal dialogue going on of, oh, I hope everyone knows that it's because I'm pregnant that I'm not dancing around like I usually do, right? Which is really this internalized ableism, right? As if like we're not just allowed to show up in whatever body we have and move however we feel like moving. And then I was sort of trying to coach myself through it, right? I was like, oh, come on, no one's judging you, and you just need to be yourself and it'll be okay. And then we took a break to eat sufganiyot, right? One of the many traditional fried foods that we eat for Hanukkah. And then the young man who was leading the music said, all right, well, let's all get back to dancing unless you've gotten too fat from those sufganiyot, he said, to a room full of 3 to 5-year-olds and their parents. And I was, on the one hand, shocked in that sense of like, dude, I'm standing right here. And also, all of those concerns that I had about, were people judging me, was like, oh, right, people are constantly judging me and having denigrating thoughts about my body. Thank you for reminding me of that. I was also, as we said before, that this can be particularly impactful on young children. So I was horrified by that. And also thinking about, what it means that he's taking something that's so lovely and central to the enjoyment of this holiday and making it something that's somehow dangerous to kids, or that they're bad for eating it. So I had all of these concerns, but then I also suddenly had this sense of like, wait a second, doesn't this person understand that this is a holiday, that Hanukkah is a holiday where what we are there to do is to celebrate fat, right? That Hanukkah is a holiday of celebrating fat as a symbol of our people's endurance and survival. And so that sort of dual experience of realizing the harm that can come from weight stigma when it shows up in Jewish communal context, but also that sense that Jewish tradition can be deployed in ways that are liberatory, was really a key moment in my own journey in this. So that's a little bit about what I call sacred time, right? Thinking about how our holiday observances, and particularly our foodways, can be spaces of impact and action. And then the last is sacred text, and how we can really approach our textual traditions as liberatory. So what I'd like to do in our remaining time is to talk a little bit more about sacred speech, because I think it is quite important. And then we're going to look at a little bit of text together. So sacred speech really comes from the sense in the Jewish tradition that our speech has the power to create or destroy worlds. So we have this image of God as creating the world through speech, right? The very opening lines of Torah are about God speaking the world into being. And then in our rabbinic tradition, we have a number of texts about the destructive power of speech, and the way that speech is like an arrow. That destructive speech is like an arrow that's shot from a bow. In other words, that it can, impact far away from where we, the speaker, are standing. And also that once it's let loose, it's not really something that we can take back. And so in our communal context, this is, a way for me of framing a Jewish moral approach to speech around bodies. And I want to share with you one suggestion for how we can change our speech in Jewish communal contexts, that I think is particularly powerful and particularly simple and not at all easy. And before I do that, before I share my one hint, I want to say that it's also important to me to think about speech, because as we said before, you don't actually have to have a wonderful relationship with your own body in order to make change in this area. And part of that is that our tradition is not a mind control tradition, right? I think it's clear to me that our tradition recognizes that our emotions come and go, and that we don't have a lot of control over them, and that even our thoughts come and go, and that we often have thoughts where we can't even tell where they're coming from or whether they belong to us. And that what we're not asking people to have to control their thoughts, but we do have this sense that the gateway of the mouth is a place where we can actually do some work with controlling what we let loose into the world, and whether the speech that we let loose is liberatory or destructive. So my one piece of advice that is, as I said, very simple and also hard to implement is to stop complimenting weight loss. And this is something that I think comes as sort of second nature to many of us, that when we see someone who we haven't seen in some time and we notice that they've lost weight, that we feel automatically that the right thing to do is to compliment them on that weight loss. And the reason that I advocate for not complimenting weight loss is that it signals to that person and also to everyone else who's hearing, right? So often also in our Jewish communal context, we're speaking in these sort of semi-public contexts where we're, have, at least when we actually gather in person, right? Where I'm theoretically speaking to one individual, but actually there are all these other people around who are hearing. So what it signals both to the person you're speaking to, signals to the person you're speaking to is that when you compliment their weight loss, is that that you're judging their previous body, the way their body was before. And it also signals to everyone else around them that it's better across the board to be thin than it is to be fat, right? It's expressing a value judgment about body size. Other good reasons not to compliment weight loss are that you, unless you have a very intimate connection with this person, don't know what the cause of their weight loss is. And you don't know whether, in fact, it might be because they are experiencing some kind of disease condition that is causing their weight loss, including the fact that you don't know whether they're experiencing depression or some other kind of mental health challenge that's causing their weight loss, or grief, which can cause weight loss, or an eating disorder. And so it may be that what you're complimenting is, in fact, very disordered and an unhealthy behavior. And you don't know that unless you have a very close relationship with them. And again, that also signals to everyone else around, not only is it just sort of a general judgment about people's bodies, but it can also be quite harmful to anyone else in hearing range who is trying to recover from an eating disorder, because it reinforces this cultural idea that actually it would be better if they were thinner. Very early on in the work of Fat Torah, I wasn't doing a lot of direct fundraising, but I had, a little donate button that I would put in my blog posts and things like that. And very early on, I got this $180 donation from someone I'd never met before. Right? I was used to getting little donations from people who were friends and family members. And suddenly I got this donation from someone I never met before. And it freaked me out a little bit. And thankfully, I turned to my mentors and peers in the new nonprofit fundraising community. And I was like, what do I do? And they said, you write to the person and you thank them and you ask them why they wanted to connect with you in this way. And so I did that. And this turned out to be someone who was not Jewish, had sort of stumbled across this blog post that I had written. And the reason that they were drawn to the work and wanted to support it is because they reported that for the last 3 years, they had not been able to connect with their spiritual community. In other words, they had not felt that they could go into the building and attend services in the ways that they had previously because they were recovering from an eating disorder. And the diet culture and just pervasive weight stigma that they encountered whenever they tried to connect with spiritual community was dangerous to their health. So that's another thing I think about thinking about who weight stigma impacts, is that absolutely it impacts the largest among us in systemic ways that are very different than the way that it impacts people who are wrestling with their own body dissatisfaction. But body dissatisfaction itself can lead to quite harmful behaviors. And we can't tell by looking out at our beautiful communities who might be struggling with those issues and who might not be, because disordered eating can happen for people in bodies of every size. So that's my pitch for this real shift in our sacred speech and I think one of the reasons that it's particularly powerful for me is because it basically involves just not saying something that you might otherwise feel compelled to say. And so it's really that beautiful place of, you're allowed to think it, you're allowed to have feelings about it. There's nothing in our tradition that says that you can control those thoughts or feelings, but that we have this choice of just simply closing our mouths and not complimenting weight loss when we see it. Any questions about that before we move into our little tiny bit of text study together? Or about anything else that we've been talking about? Or anything that I didn't answer that you really still want me to address? I'm pouring myself a little bit of seltzer while I give you all a chance to think. Okay, so we're going to move into this text study, and this really gets at, for me, this question that was in our title, right? What's Jewish about fat activism? Excuse me, sorry. Here we go. Which is that we saw in that 1973 manifesto, and you heard when I was talking about health at every size, that there's been this approach to fat activism and fat liberation that's really been based on sort of this sense of, if only people knew the facts about the inefficacy of weight loss, and if only people knew the facts about the discrimination that fat people face, that logic would simply lead them to agree that fat people should have equal treatment. And what's clear to me is that that's not enough. And what's also clear to me is that our Jewish tradition and our Jewish communities are places where we actually have the option of finding our moral voices and using our moral voices to address these issues. And in particular, the issue that I want to address is the issue of human worth. And so we're going to take a look at some texts around human worth. And this is also to say that when I talk about Fat Torah and people want to know what that means, I'm often asked, well, what are the texts that you use that particularly address issues of fatness? And if you are curious about that, I'm actually this fall, a little teaser, this fall I'm going to be running an 8-session Fat Torah Beit Midrash, where we're going to look at all kinds of topics through the lens of ancient and modern texts. We haven't publicly announced that yet, so definitely join the mailing list or find some other way to be in touch with me if you're interested in that. But what's important to me to say, and what you'll see in these texts that we're going to look at together, is that what's more important to me than the specific text and what the text says about people's bodies is the lens that we bring to it and our own desire to deploy texts in ways that are liberatory. So the texts that we're looking at don't actually mention body size particularly at all. Let me share our source sheet with you. But do speak about human worth. And so that's what we're going to look at. And some of these texts, again, may be very, very familiar to many of you. If we had more time, we could also break out and do some learning in our breakout rooms about this. But in the interest of time and And given the size of our group, we're gonna do this all together. So these questions of human worth really center around the idea, the great big Jewish idea that all human beings are created in the divine image. And that begins right with the very first chapter of Bereshit, the very first chapter of Genesis, when God says, let us make Adam in our image, after our likeness. And then in the next verse, we read that in fact, that is exactly what God did. That all human beings, male and female, were created in the divine image. So, and then later on, we also have this idea, this reiteration that when God created Adam, God made Adam in the likeness of God. Then we have this. Wait, I'm going to skip. I'm going to come back to the Vayikra Rabbah. No, well, let's look at it. So there's this lovely midrash, this lovely interpretive text in Vayikra Rabbah that tells a story. Does anyone feel like reading this story where it starts, the compassionate one that's good to one's soul? Unmute yourself or raise a hand, or I can read. Okay. So it's this lovely story. I'm going to read and paraphrase as I go, about Hillel the Elder. So when Hillel the Elder was leaving his students would walk with him. And they would say to him, Rabbi, where are you walking to? And he said to them, to fulfill a commandment. And they asked him, what is this commandment? And he said, the commandment is to bathe in the bathhouse. So we have to give a little context here. This is a very shocking thing for a rabbi to say to his students, because the bathhouse, right, is this very, very Hellenistic, very Greek or Roman kind of place where there's concern often on the rabbinic side of things about sort of worship of the body and also worship of actual statues of bodies. And so that's part of why this is so shocking to Hillel the Elder students, that he would say that bathing in the bathhouse is a mitzvah, is a commandment. So they said to him, but is this really a commandment? And he said to them, yes, just like the statues of kings that are set up in theaters and circuses, just as with those statues, the one who's appointed over them bathes them and scrubs them, and they give him sustenance, and furthermore, he attains status for the leaders of the kingdom. I, who am created in the divine image and form, as it is written, for in the image of God, God made Adam, even more so. So in other words, he's saying, look, if these Romans are, scrubbing their statues of kings, and that, and if the people who take care of those statues have this status, then shouldn't I, who has this bodily form that was actually created in the divine image, shouldn't I also do this work of bathing and physically treating well this form that I've been given? And what I love about this, right, is that it's not mentioning that he had a body that was a particular form or that was a particular shape. It's more this sense that because he was created in God's image, as we all are, that he was commanded to bathe it and be good in this way. And the next text that we have is really the text that I think really speaks to this question of human worth. And it comes from, in a little while, down farther in the text, we're going to get this midrash, this interpretive teaching, about God, comparing God to a king of flesh and blood, and saying that one of the amazing things about God and God's greatness is that when a king of flesh and blood wants to make coins in his image, in the king's image, he stamps out the coins, and all the coins look exactly alike. But that when God creates humans in God's image, every single one of us looks different. Before we get to that text, I want to say that part of what's so powerful to me about this text is its context. which is actually in the context of how you instruct witnesses who are deciding whether someone who has committed murder should get the death penalty or not. And in other words, when they are talking about the value of every single human life, what they're talking about is people who, as witnesses in this case, have been given the power to take a person's life. And so the reason that that this context feels so important to me actually is because they're not talking about human worth as being something that's only for good people, right? They're talking about someone who is a criminal and has engaged in very bad acts and is still someone whose worth is meant to be, as a human being, is meant to be taken with the utmost seriousness, because that person is irreplaceable and of ultimate and infinite value, that their life is of ultimate and infinite value. And it's in that context that we have this idea, first this one that I'm sharing here, that anyone who sustains a single human being, it's as if he sustained an entire world, and that anyone who destroys a person, it's as if he destroys an entire world, right? So this idea of the infinite value of every human life. And then and it's in that context that we get this lovely, lovely midrash about how when the Blessed Holy One stamps all the people with the seal of Adam HaRishon, of the very first human, which is also meaning in God's image, that not one of them is similar to one another. And so what feels so important to me about this text as a text on body diversity is that in our tradition, we see the diversity of humans, including our bodies, as not only a valuable thing for communities, right? I think often when we talk about diversity and inclusion in communities, we talk about, what's valuable to the individual in being included. And we talk about diversity as potentially quite valuable to the community because of what it means to have a lot of different opinions and viewpoints. But here there's this sense that diversity is also, and diversity of bodies is also a theological issue, because if we want to fully express our sense of God's greatness, that the way to do that is to appreciate the diversity of human beings, including our bodies. So I'm going to end with that.